Yeah, last week we skipped the waiver wire video. This week, we're not doing so. Last week, the waiver wire was absolute garbage. This week, I think you have potential league winners for the fantasy playoffs. But anyway, let's first dive into the players that I think you can safely drop at this point. Starting off with Ricky Pearsall. Now, I picked up Ricky Pearsall myself a few weeks back when you had the Brandon Ayuk injury, thinking, oh, it's a good offense. Pearsall is the round one NFL draft capital. Maybe he ends up doing something. And yeah, his first game in, he looks somewhat interesting. I've been holding him on my bench. I don't know why. I mean, at this point, this is the third straight goose egg. He's still rostered in 38% of leagues on Sleeper. I, for whatever reason, still have this guy on my bench, but I'm going through, and honestly, I'm going to drop him right this second, even though I'm already planning on dropping him with my waiver wire moves later on. We'll talk about in the video. I'm looking at Rashad Bateman. Rashad Bateman's a receiver that's been fine. Obviously, he's playing over Deontay Johnson, but now he's banged up, and even if he is good to go coming out of the bye week, the issue is you have the week 14 bye, so you're going to have to roster him through his bye week, and then you're looking at weeks 15, 16, 17 in the fantasy playoffs. And my question to you is, if you are a fantasy football playoff team, is there any world in which you are starting him? No. The only way you'd ever start a player of his caliber is if you were desperate during the bye week. A lot of people are going to be desperate during the week 14 buys because there are a lot of them, but Bateman's on by himself, so let him go. I think you can safely drop Tyler Lockett as well. I mean, this is, I want to say, the fourth straight week of Jackson Smith-Njigba leading this team in fantasy points, and this is the fourth straight week of Tyler Lockett giving you pretty much nothing. The last game you had Lockett seeing 5 targets or more was back in week 7 against the Atlanta Falcons. So Lockett has been completely phased out of this offense. It is very difficult to ever see you starting him outside of, I mean, maybe if DK Metcalf misses this next week with his injury, then you can look at him. But even in that instance, I personally wouldn't. Going over looking at Demario Douglas, I know a lot of people are rostering Douglas. I mean, 47% of Sleeper has him right now. But I mean, still, this is a receiver where I don't necessarily see where the upside's going to come from. I mean, if you look at what you have right now with this New England Patriots offense, the passing volume has been down, and now you are getting additional volume going to the tight end position also with Austin Hooper. They are getting a ton of receivers involved. They're spreading the ball out. I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if Demario Douglas ends up seeing another spike week in the fantasy playoffs where he randomly scores 20 plus points. But again, you're never actually comfortable putting him in your lineup. He has the week 14 bye. There's no reason to roster him through the bye week when you're not going to start him in week 15. Raheem Mostert, I would say, again, is a drop. I know we've said this, a ton now, but he's still rostered in 52% of leagues on Sleeper. I mean, this is a running back that even if HN were to go down, he has to split the backfield with Jalen Wright. So the last time you had double-digit fantasy points was back in week 8. I mean, remember after that week, we were screaming sell high, sell high, sell high based off the usage with these running backs. And yeah, since then, the man has not had a single game with double-digit fantasy points, and he doesn't even have the handcuff appeal because, again, if you were to see the injury, it would turn into a running back by committee. I'm going over to Jalen McMillan. 15% of people are rostering McMillan. I don't know why I'm talking about him. Maybe we can laugh at Zach for still rostering him in our league. But Wan'Dale Robinson is a receiver that I saw still rostered in my league, and he's rostered in 58% of leagues on Sleeper at the moment. With Wan'Dale, this is a receiver that, yes, gives you the strong stretch of games where you had no Malik Neighbors early in this season. But I do want to reiterate with Wan'Dale Robinson that this is one of the worst offenses in the NFL, and Malik Neighbors is going to absolutely dominate targets here as the number one option. Going over to our next drop, I think we are going to have the 49ers defense. If you are looking at San Francisco, I actually drafted this defense coming into the season. I dropped them, I want to say 6 weeks ago, whenever they were going to play the Kansas City Chiefs. I believe I dropped them then. But nonetheless, it's a defense that has just been absolutely riddled with injuries. If you go through and look at over the past 2 weeks, keep in mind, obviously, Nick Bosa is injured, their key defensive engine. You've had a total of -6 points over the past 2 weeks. They've allowed over 300 yards both games. they have generated 0 turnovers over the past 2 weeks. They've had 1 turnover over their last 4 games, and you're not getting nearly as many pressures. The matchups you have over the next few weeks are going to go up against Chicago, the Rams, Miami, and Detroit. So I think we maybe have some better defensive streamers for you later on. And then looking at specifically CJ Stroud, maybe it seems aggressive to say to go through and drop him. CJ Stroud is currently rostered in 92% of leagues at this point. But realistically, if you look at CJ Stroud, the last game that you've had 20 fantasy points from him was back in week 4 against the Jacksonville. Yes, back in week 4. What was that? Was that in not even October? Was that still September? You have the bye week in week 14. So you're going to have to pick up another quarterback for this week regardless. I don't know if I would be looking to hold on to Stroud. I think we have a better pickup that you can have at the quarterback position. But again, obviously, I'm going to be updating my rankings with every single player talked about in this video over on flockfantasy.com. And if you wanted to know the exact waiver wire moves that you should be making with your team, you can actually link your team if you play on Sleeper, ESPN, or Yahoo for completely free over on flockfantasy.com. Just go to the My Teams page, and then on the far right column, you are actually going to be able to see the best waiver wire available pickups for your league in particular. And you would actually be able to see what players you should potentially drop as well based on the average expert rest of season consensus rankings. So definitely would recommend taking advantage of that free tool that we have over there for y'all, because obviously if you're playing in a 14-team league, you can see with that tool, okay, maybe I shouldn't drop CJ Stroud. Whereas if you're playing in a 10-team format, you can see with that tool, oh, okay, actually these 3 or these 4 quarterbacks are ranked higher than CJ Stroud in the rest of season rankings. It would be easy to let him go. But I'll leave a link for that in the description and comment section. Again, like I said, it is completely free. But let's go ahead and let's talk about the players that are actually worth adding, starting with the number 1 ad that we have had in a very long time with Isaac Guerendo. Now, this is a running back that just had the red carpet laid out in front of him, where they have said, okay, buddy, not only are you going to have no Christian McCaffrey to deal with, but you are also going to have no Jordan Mason to deal with. You are the running back 1. And obviously, the running back 1 in San Francisco has been an absolute dominant force. We have seen McCaffrey over the past few years be the running back 1 in fantasy, and it's not even remotely close. We saw Jordan Mason early in the season account for over 80% of the snaps in this Niners backfield, and we saw Jordan Mason really be a consistent running back 1. Now, I will be a wet blanket with this situation with Isaac Guerendo, and I'll say, no, he is not going to be a consistent running back 1 in fantasy. No, he's not going to be a top 15 option, really, even. At least in my rest of season rankings, I personally have Isaac Guerendo as a low-end RB2. And a big reason for this is I just think that you have to have realistic expectations for this offense in San Francisco, where you are looking at this Niners offense going into this past week, actually projecting to be a bottom 5 offense in total points scored. And then obviously you saw them struggle there against the Buffalo Bills, man, be a bottom 5 offense in total points scored. This week, it's maybe going to be a little bit different. If you are actually looking at the spread against Chicago, they are currently favored by 1.5. They have an implied team total of about 24 points, so they should be about an average offense this week, or at least that's what sportsbooks are saying. But again, the expectations with the Niners are much lowered in comparison to where they were earlier this season. So this is not the same offensive line. This is not the same offense. This isn't the same team that you had Jordan Mason running with at the beginning of the season. Not only that, but with Isaac Guerendo as well, it is very difficult to come out and say that we know they are going to use him as a true 3-down workhorse. I mean, just because we ended up seeing it with Jordan Mason early in the season, and just because it is definitely a possibility, it doesn't inherently mean that it is going to be a guarantee here. I mean, one thing to point out with Isaac Guerendo is this wasn't a running back that was a phenomenal pass catcher at Louisville. Obviously, a phenomenal athlete. Obviously, has the size to handle a 3-down workload, so that is encouraging. I will say, if you have any fab dollars left, you blow the load. I can't tell you that he's for sure going to be as good as Jordan Mason was, but I do think that you spend every dollar you have left because he is a starting running back for free off the waiver wire. Now, going over to some other options I want to talk about. Adam Thielen is going to be a receiver that a lot of people flood to go through and pick up. And I do want to admit that, yeah, Bryce Young over the past 2 weeks has been great. Bryce Young over the past 2 weeks has put together the best 2 games that we have seen from him all season now. And with Adam Thielen this past week, you actually have the 10 targets, the 8 receptions, the 99 receiving yards, and the receiving touchdown. This marks a season high in every single major statistical category. And if you go through and if you look at what you had at the end of last season as well, I mean, the last time you had a game this strong for Adam Thielen was back in week 6 in 2023. So this has a lot of people extremely excited about Adam Thielen. Obviously, you have no Deontay Johnson here anymore. I will maybe be the wet blanket on the situation where, for me personally, I think Adam Thielen more so is going to be a spot start if you are desperate with week 14 buys. For me to come through and try to call him some potential league winning option like I think Isaac Rindo maybe is a stretch, because I mean, if we do take a step backwards and really look at what we've had with Bryce Young, well, of course, I want to say that Bryce Young has been phenomenal, or I don't know, a poor choice of word. He's been very good over the past 2 weeks. Still, you have a massive sample of Bryce Young being disappointing. And if you are looking at sportsbooks with their implied team totals, right now you have the Carolina Panthers still projecting out as a bottom 5 offense in the NFL this week. That may change as the week goes on, but I still think it's a very bad offense. I think Adam Thielen does have target competition. I think he's a 34-year-old wide receiver. I think he's more so a spot start due to buys rather than a potential league winner. I'm going over to Hollywood Brown. With Hollywood, I feel like we just have to talk about him for a second. I did move him up in our rankings where, I mean, essentially I'm ranking him for the first time in a while. We have news last week that Hollywood should be cleared within 3 to 4 weeks. So maybe Hollywood's going to be good to go for week 16. Maybe Hollywood's going to be good to go for week 17 for the fantasy playoffs. The only instance that this matters is if you're playing in an extremely deep 14-team league with multiple flex spots, and maybe you have to start 3 receivers. But in reality, if you're playing in a 10-team format, do not rush out there to pick up Hollywood Brown unless maybe you can throw him on your IR if you have an open IR slot at this point of the season. Because like there's no way you can start him his first week back. If his first week back is in week 16, then who freaking cares? Because the fantasy playoffs will be done in week 17. I'm going over to Parker Washington. I know a lot of people are going to be going through and looking at Parker Washington as a very interesting pickup where he does have a really strong performance. And keep in mind, you really only have Brian Thomas and Evan Ingram to compete with targets here in Jacksonville. You have 12 targets, 6 receptions, over 100 receiving yards in the receiving touchdown. You score a total of 24 points. But the reality of the situation is, again, this should be one of the worst offenses in the league. I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if Lawrence is shut down for the rest of the season here, with the Jacksonville Jaguars being completely out of it, with him going through concussion protocol after a nasty hit. So with Mac Jones, I'm not excited to start as wide receiver 2. I think he'll let somebody else pick up Parker Washington. I know we've had a lot of people asking us about Tua Tagovailoa. Obviously with Tua, I mean, the man's been great. He's rostered in 75% of leagues, so it's probably going to be very difficult to go through and pick him up. He's had 3 straight performances with over 20 fantasy points. I do want to reiterate, more likely than not, you are viewing him as a streaming option here rest of season. Now, with that being said, he's been a very strong streaming option. But one bad thing that you have, or the main knock that you have with Tua, of course, is the fact that you have no rushing upside. I know Chris Rodriguez had a bunch of usage at the very end of this past week. In reality, I think the guy that you'd be looking at in Washington alongside Brian Robinson would be Jeremy McNichols. But again, this is an instance where I think you should probably let your league mates go through and pick him up, because if you are looking at McNichols, at the end of the day, this is at best a handcuff running back, where if Brian Robinson were to get injured, then he probably splits the backfield with Chris Rodriguez. So I don't know. I feel like we got to talk about Jeremy McNichols solely for the reason to point out that the usage with Chris Rodriguez was primarily at the end of the game, not something we need to overthink. Just don't pick up Chris Rodriguez for whatever you do. Looking at an actual interesting pickup, we probably should have talked about him right next to Isaac Grindo. You have Jaleel McLaughlin really coming through and taking over as the starting running back in this game against the Cleveland Browns. Now, of course, I want to maybe be a little bit hesitant here in that they are using just a ton, and I mean a ton of running backs here in Denver. Not only do you have Jaleel leading this team, but you also have Estime getting involved, where Estime sees a total of 3 targets. You have Michael Burton with a rushing touchdown. I know, obviously, not concerned about the running back usage there. You have Javonte Williams with a rushing touchdown as well, and 4 opportunities. So, I mean, if you are looking at what we have, actually we'll include the targets for Javonte, where you have 2 there. I mean, you're looking at 9 total opportunities. The running backs not named Jaleel McLaughlin, whereas with Jaleel himself, you're looking at 16. And so this is a spot where maybe Jaleel is trending towards being the starting running back in Denver. But we've seen this before, where we get the head fake with Audric Estime a few weeks back, just for the next week, Javonte Williams to actually be the guy. Jaleel, I think I would rank a year alongside Javonte Williams, kind of as an RB4 in our rest of season rankings, but definitely trending in the right direction, where if you see Jaleel be the starting running back again next week, or the guy that gets the majority of the work, then I think he can continue to rise further, and you could possibly consider starting him in week 15. And then going over and looking at Jameis Winston, with Jameis, it is a situation that is, in my mind, a little annoying from a real life perspective, where a lot of people come through, they glaze up Jameis as if he needs to be for sure starting quarterback in 2025. In my mind, like, the interceptions just from a real life perspective are a killer. But for a fantasy perspective, who gives a damn? The man drops 36 fantasy points, where he had the 500 passing yards. I mean, if you're looking at the 5 past games that you've had from Jameis, 3 of them, you've seen him go over 20 fantasy points. I mean, if you're looking at points per game over the past 5 weeks, Jameis Winston is putting up QB1 numbers. Now, for me, I think Jameis does slide into being like the streaming quarterback range. The reason I'm not going to be super excited to pick him up is because this next week, you'd have a really tough matchup going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So, I don't know. I understand that Jameis has the rushing touchdown against Pittsburgh in the snow game 2 weeks back. But I mean, in that contest, he only had 14.5 points. I think Jameis is a weekly streamer, and I really want him in good matchups. And bad matchups like Pittsburgh, it's kind of whatever. I mean, you also have to go up against KC in week 15 as well. And then going over and looking at some desperation defenses for you to pick up this week. Now, DSTs are very difficult. I wish I would have really planned ahead. I wish I would have picked up a defense and dropped Ricky Pearsall last week. I have the Texans on bye this week. I probably have to go through and drop the Texans to get somebody, because if you're looking at the Texans coming out of the bye week, they have Miami. That's not a super good matchup. Then week 16, they have the Chiefs. So I'm going to be dropping the Houston Texans defense no matter what this week. But obviously, with this many teams on bye, it is going to be difficult to go out there and find a super exciting pickup. I think you can look at the Miami Dolphins, where they are heavily favored over the New York Jets at home. I think you can look at the New Orleans Saints, where they are going to be playing against the New York Giants. And I think you can be looking at the Tennessee Titans, where they have a very strong matchup, where they're going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, under the assumption that you have no Trevor Lawrence. But again, I do want to reiterate that these are desperation defenses. I mean, they have good matchups, but they've been garbage fantasy defenses all season. So I don't necessarily know if we can be super, super excited about picking them up, but it's a tough spot with all the buys. But really do appreciate y'all, and really hope I was able to help you out in some way with this. And of course, if you wanted to get the exact recommended waiver wire pickups for your fantasy football team in your fantasy football league, If you play on Sleeper, ESPN, or Yahoo, you can link your team for completely free with flockfantasy.com. Just go to the My Teams page, link your team, and look at the waiver wire column in the far right corner. I'll leave the link in the description and comment section for y'all. But again, thank you. Really appreciate you, and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.